We are all pleased to have you all here. My name is Pelekanou, and I am member of the board of director of Prometheus Research Institute. We are pleased to have you here, and we are pleased as Prometheus Research Institute to be part of the discussion organized this year by the Cyprus Forum. We look forward for an interactive discussion with today's audience. As Prometheus Institute, we chose to focus on foreign policy issues, and especially how the international system is in a period of global restructuring and how these changes affect Cyprus in many aspects. It has become increasingly evident that democratic systems and institutions are through an ongoing process of change. On the one hand, these are changes that needed to be made to serve transparency, rule of law, and participatory democracy. Yet, at the same time, immense inequalities, poverty, extremes have become major players in political systems. Conflicts across the globe push people to migrate, and these are all realities on the rise that need to be discussed. We are pleased today to have three speakers that each one of them will assess how this global restructuring is affecting Cyprus, and we will discuss after with our audience and online with the questions that we will receive all other aspects that relate to today's discussion. Our first speaker is Mrs. Stavri Kalopsidiotou. Then we are pleased to have Professor Kostas Gouliamos. And our third speaker, Sotiroula, Charalambous, will explore how labor relations in Cyprus are affected by all this restructuring. Now the floor is to Stavri. Stavri, she's a doctor of public international law and member of the Bureau for the Cyprus issue of the Central Committee of AKEL. She will unveil how global restructuring is affecting the international system with a special focus on the Cyprus problem. The floor is on to Stavri now.
Good morning to everyone. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. Allow me to start by stating that in the wake of another conflict, the undeterred, allow me to suggest, offensive of Azerbaijan against the Armenians in Artsakh, this discussion appears overly timely. It is another war with devastating humanitarian consequences, first and foremost, against the targeted population as well as for the entire region. The war in Ukraine, which has had already a huge cost in human lives and man-made disasters, continues to affect severely the living conditions of millions of people, including in Europe. Adding to the suffering caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, to other numerous ongoing conflicts afflicting the international community, and to the devastating consequences of natural disasters, all exacerbating the humanitarian catastrophes across the globe. The virtual abandonment of diplomatic means for the settlement of international disputes, resort to military power for which both NATO and the EU, allow me to say, are accomplices, the erosion of guardrails to effectively respond to humanitarian needs, the lack of determination, meaningful, committed, and principled efforts to resolve frozen conflicts render the world a theater of insecurity, in which political biases and anarchy gradually gain prevalence. The International Rescue Committee estimates that more than 100 million people today are on the run from conflict and disaster, that in 2023, 340 million are projected to be in need of humanitarian assistance, a figure that has grown fourfold in the past decades. Only yesterday, the UNHCR stated that 2,500 migrants died or went missing while trying to cross the Mediterranean to Europe so far in 2023, a number that marks a large increase over the 1,680 dead or missing migrants in the same period in 2022. Against this background, I shall emphasize that it is not enough to only understand crisis. The international community, the future of which is informed by today's all-faceted globalization, if it is to have a viable projection in terms of global security, stability, and prosperity, needs to adopt concerted, comprehensive measures addressing not simply the consequences, but mostly the root causes of crisis and links among them. Against today's complex and harsh global environment, the prevalent dilemma is among two diverse courses of action that will determine the shape of our world in the future to come. Accept first the global weakening or even complete dismantling of international, regional, and local mechanisms intended to prevent and reduce crisis in the name of pragmatism and on the rails of power politics, or revamp observance to the core principles agreed to govern international relations, of international law in particular, ranging from social justice to peace. Inevitably, it is this second path which can only produce an orderly, principles-based, and hence truly functioning international system, whereas the first will continue to serve only a minor segment of the global society, albeit even that in an ephemeral way, if one considers the long-term effects, for example, of climate change, which is unquestionably a crisis with no borders. With the spotlight on what is going on in Ukraine, a war that poses enormous and direct challenges and dangers for the entire humanity, hegemonic states have intensified aggression, a reality also felt in our wider region. Old and open wounds have been rekindled, pushing for the creation of a new fait accompli, regardless of their illegal nature. It is enough to observe what has been going on in Palestine, in Syria, in Libya, and of course in Cyprus, to conclude that we are at the crossroads of choosing between the anarchy of power politics and a conscious return to a more orderly international system. Yet, it would be naive to expect that the tolerance exhibited by the international community towards the so-called hegemonic states, such as Turkey and Israel, will change overnight. On the contrary, a change of direction requires that the United Nations, as the international organization entrusted by all states to safeguard international peace and security, become more responsive against all professed violations of international law. And that in the midst of this volatile environment, those mostly affected by relevant crises seek to take ownership of the efforts to address and resolve them according to the relevant principles of international law, as this is the only context within which even the less powerful states can convincingly assert their rights and try to resolve disputes and conflicts orderly and sustainably. And this brings me to the Cyprus problem, the solution of which seems distant in the circumstances described. The war in Ukraine and the imminent shift towards a new Cold War environment, with NATO gaining ground and the EU seeking to advance its militarist orientation and geostrategic role in complementarity with the alliance, have revamped the strategic role of Turkey. This, along with the pre-existing vested interests on trade, migration, arms industry, its role as an energy corridor, its vital role in NATO, provide for the general tolerance exhibited towards Ankara and explain EU's hesitation to impose substantial restrictive measures following its illegal actions in the EEZ of the Republic or the illegal alteration of the status quo in Varosha. After the collapse of the Crans-Montana Conference on Cyprus in 2017, followed by the longest ever negotiating stalemate, Turkey and the Turkish Cypriot leader have not only indulged in further illegal activities, but alarmingly recurred to their unacceptable position for a two-state solution, thus ignoring previous agreements, UN resolutions, core principles of international law, and convergences that have been achieved. Since this position represents a non-starting point for future negotiations, it will eventually have detrimental effects on stability and security for Cyprus, but also for the wider region. The EU-Turkey relations, energy security, migration, the financial burden of the United Nations, human rights of all Cypriots will not be effectively addressed, but will remain hostage to a status quo that deteriorates by the day. The consequent question then is how, against this exact background, informed by the tolerance of the international community and the Turkish intransigence, we can re-engage in a meaningful peace process and succeed in resolving the Cyprus problem on the agreed basis. Sterile criticism is never enough, no matter how just it could be. It is therefore imperative that the forces on the island which support the reunification of the country and its people share a proactive, multidimensional, and convincing approach, which from its outset should be based on the following. Professed commitment to uphold the acquis of previous negotiations, which is based on overarching principles of international law and takes into consideration the legitimate concerns of both communities. Emphasis on the benefits of all stakeholders and sides to the conflict through the agreed solution, supplemented by concrete measures. And thirdly, to the extent possible, constructive utilization of EU-Turkey relations, meaning the support of a positive agenda conducive to the creation of better conditions for also addressing the concerns of Cyprus. On these exact pillars, and taking note of the UN Secretary General's repeated reference of relevant UNSC resolutions to the continuation of the talks from where they left off in 2017, and to the use of natural gas issue as an incentive for the solution, in 2021, AKEL formed a holistic proposal submitted to the ex-President Anastasiadis and presented anew to President Christodoulidis. In brief, the two main aspects of the said proposals are: one, the expression of concrete commitment to continue the negotiation from where it had left off with the 2014 joint declaration, the Gutierrez framework, and the convergences registered, by highlighting the validity of the convergences on political equality and the effective participation of the Turkish Cypriot community in all organs of power and the decision-making, including one positive vote for any decision of the Ministerial Council, and expressing readiness for the submission of the appropriate time of bringing proposals on the pending issues of the Gutierrez framework with a view to reaching a speedy agreement on a strategic understanding. And two, the creation of incentives in the area of energy directed both towards the Turkish Cypriot community and Turkey. Regarding in specific the incentives for Turkey, it suggests that after the solution of the Cyprus problem, the Federal Republic and Turkey shall commence negotiations with a view to defining the exclusive economic zone on the basis of the international law of the sea, and that irrespective of the progress of the delimitation negotiations, once an agreement on a solution of the Cyprus problem has been reached, the Federal Republic of Cyprus and Turkey should begin talks with a view to concluding a mutually beneficial agreement on the route of a gas pipeline to Turkey, provided, of course, that a fertile ground exists from an economic and from a technical perspective. Additionally, the proposal notes that with the overall settlement of the Cyprus problem, the Federal Republic will not raise any obstacles to Turkey's participation in the energy plans in the region. In the shadow of the energy crisis caused by the war and sanctions imposed on Russia, the debate among various international actors on the creation of new energy security formations and the exploitation of the potential that exists or can be created towards this end, this proposal seems particularly timely. Furthermore, it overturns the arguments for a two-state solution and sovereign equality through a concrete commitment to uphold political equality and effective participation of the Turkish Cypriots in the federal government. Whether the aforementioned could suffice to remove Turkey from its current position is, we have to admit, unpredictable. But what is certain is that unless we take ownership of the initiatives, provide targeted and convincing proposals, complete reliance on external factors will prove inadequate, whether this is the context of EU-Turkish relations or a spillover effect of a potential progress of the Greek-Turkish dialogue. Past experience reveals that they can affect positively, indeed, the political environment, but that they cannot determine the final outcome on the ground and stop the entrenchment of division per se. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stavri, for this comprehensive evaluation of today's situation in the Cyprus problem and concrete proposals. Please keep your questions or comments after we finish with all our three speakers. We now have Professor Kostas Gouliamos, Ordinary Member of the European Academy of Sciences and Art, former Rector of the European University of Cyprus, and Deputy President of the Board of Directors of the Prometheus Research Institute. Professor Gouliamos will stimulate today's discussion with deep thoughts and concerns over the multipolar world, realignments, and the role of emerging powers. The floor is yours, Professor.
Thank you very much. The way that my colleague expressed, in her paper, the ideas that govern our modern world, reminds me the Tempest written by Shakespeare. The hell is empty and all devils are here, said Shakespeare. So in the first quarter of the 21st century, international developments are marked by the barbaric and inhuman enterprise of imperialism to impose the new order throughout the world. Humanity is living dark times because of imperialist aggression, notably by the Anglo-American and NATO invasions around the world, attacks on air assaults which manifest itself in extent and in depth the capitalist economy, annihilation of labor rights, social policy, and the environment by hegemonizing the political apparatus and consequently by militarization of the life world. Marxism has the offer and still generates analytical and methodological tools. The most powerful are Marx's theory of surplus value and Lenin's theory of imperialism. Particularly, Lenin proves the ultimate in capitalist brutality. Almost 110 years after it was written, Lenin's classic Marxist theory of imperialism, principally articulated in his book Imperialism, the Higher Stage of Capitalism, remains the best framework to understand capitalism's international political economy. Indeed, Lenin's theory is a fundamental tool to understand the geopolitical setting of the 21st century. For Lenin, the key to understand today's imperialism is monopoly. He argued if it were necessary to give the briefest possible definition of imperialism, we should have to say that imperialism is the monopoly stage of capitalism. In any case, Lenin outlined 5 principal features characterizing imperialism at the beginning of the 20th century, although these principles are still remain. Monopoly is at the core of all our 5. These 5 principles are, first, the tradition from free competition to monopoly production. Second, the formation on this basis of monopolistic trusts, cartels, and banks, and their merger into a new higher form of monopoly, in other words, finance capital, and the creation of a financial oligarchy. Third, the exceptional importance of export of capital as opposed to export of commodities. Fourth, beginning of division of the world between international monopolist businesses. And fifth, completion of division of the world between the great powers. However, since Lenin wrote, some forms of monopoly have changed. Nevertheless, Lenin's theory has proven to be a highly flexible instrument for understanding imperialism today. Using it does not mean memorizing the lines of his book, but studying the book and the specific forms of contemporary monopoly. This is necessary to uncover the modern ways in which value is sucked from the poor countries by imperialist capital. For instance, modern multinational corporations constitute a higher form of capitalist monopoly than the cartels and trusts of Lenin's era. It is strengthening, not a weakening, a capitalist monopoly that has made a greater degree of private control possible. Increasingly, large and dominant imperialist states supported multinational corporations wielding scientific and technological monopolies on international markets. The modern, highly specialized international division of labor associated with globalization of production more perfectly express the character of imperialist monopoly than previous, less advanced forms. There is a greater sophistication in the modern division of labor. In any case, capitalism shows into new territories, even if there were no tendency for the rate of profit to fall. Disproportionately disruptions and nor insufficient aggregate demand. What drives the expansion of the expansion is the constant search for economic rents of the or above, sorry for a minute because of this, of above average profits. In any way, I will indicate how these factors affect the practices of capitalist imperialism in our times. First, the way in which capital expansion takes place is conditioned by changes in the technological capabilities of firms and their state supporters. Contemporary economic globalization is driven by enormous advances in the technologies of transportation, communication, and monitoring. Second, the nature of the state and related class relations of societies confronting the import of capital have a profound effect on how imperial domination does or does not take place. Third, changes in the relation of rival capitalist blocs can recognize imperialist politics. Note that alliances among capitalist enterprises not be defined nationally, although Lenin stressed the issue of uneven development of national capitalist blocs in his analysis of the fundamental causes of the First World War. Fourth, the nature of institutions governing the interstate relations have an important effect on forms of imperialism. Organizations such as G7, International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, and the World Bank matter. In the post-war years, United States foreign policy elites have faithfully attempted to create global institutions which can use their authority derived from the most powerful national governments to regulate trade disputes and keep barriers to commodity trade and capital movements low, intensify the integration of countries facing debt crisis into the networks of global capitalist control. On the other side, earlier this year, BRICS officially overtook the G7 in share of world GDP, a move that is likely to cement the bloc standing as a premier global forum. Dozens of countries have lined up to join BRICS, and an estimated 40 nations have reportedly shown interest in closer alignment. By the IMF's projections, BRICS countries will constitute more of the world economy in 2023, close to $56 trillion, than the G7, $52 trillion. Moreover, globally, most countries face political intimidation, economic coercion, or harassment by the United States maritime militias. This is all done to build imperialist occupation globally that can only have a bloody conclusion with ordinary people suffering most. Fifth, changes in the power and distribution of the means of military coercion have an important effect on facilitating or limiting imperial conflict. breakthroughs in command and control technology within the most advanced military organizations have, notably NATO, made it easier for imperial planners to contemplate military interventions to discipline outlier or renegade states. It is not accidental that United States funding for military research and development rose by 24% between 2012 and 2022. For the first time, military spending exceeds $2 trillion worldwide to reach $2.113 trillion, about 1.9 trillion euros. Half was spent by NATO members. The United States spent the most, more than $800 billion, costing United States taxpayers an estimated $55 billion annually. The United States controls about 750 bases in at least 80 countries around the world and spends more on its military than the next 10 countries combined. 119 base sites in Germany, 119 in Japan, 73 in Korea, and 44 in Italy. At least 25 times, United States bases been used to launch wars of choice or military interventions in 15 countries in the greater Middle East alone since 1980. For decades, the hundreds of military bases have been used by Washington to export ideology-driven wars, subvert governments, and instigate violence and crimes. Since its founding in 1776, the United States has been at war for 93% of its existence. As United States becomes increasingly dishonest in exporting war and creating scenes of misery and tragedy in other countries, the military-industrial technology complex, the economic elites that fan the flames of conflict and abandon this complex are the ultimate beneficiaries. And 6, the nature of the relation of the metropolitan working and professional managerial classes to the imperialist projects of their nation states are crucial for the understanding of the sustainability of imperialist politics. Overall, these 6 points helps us identify the contradictions which face any imperial or would-be imperial power. Because of their complexity, there is always a high degree of fragility about the global geopolitical setting in which governing elites, financial oligarchy, and capitalists operate. And this fragility often leads to catastrophic outputs that we face in our modern world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Gouliamos, for outlining the main characteristics of today's world. We now proceed to our third speaker. Pleased to have here with us today Mrs. Sotiroula Charalambous, General Secretary of the Pancyprian Federation of Labour, PEO. She will talk on the effects of international and regional restructuring and the crisis that all this create on labor and the economy of Cyprus.
Thank you very much, Maria. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to be part of this interesting panel. As Maria said, I was asked to focus my intervention on the effects of international and regional restructuring and crisis on labor and the economy in Cyprus. When we are talking about restructuring processes of social and economic systems, we have to bear in mind that we are looking at mid-term and long-term processes. Therefore, it makes sense to look at them with a bird's-eye perspective so as to understand the emergence and evolution of these processes in the long run. The second remark I should do at this point is that economic crises in capitalism have always been initiating drivers of restructuring processes with determining impact on labor. The third remark I want to make is that economic crisis is a unique capitalist phenomenon, in fact, a recurring phenomenon. In the mid-70s, the most advanced economy of the world underwent a recessionary phase characterized by high inflation and high unemployment, known as stagflation. This crisis marked the end of the post-World II era of high growth rates and capital accumulation regime with high profit rates. This regime was deemed to be replaced by a new regime based on the old classical ideas of the invisible hand of the laissez-faire, dressed now in a new stylish outlook, which was meant to go into the economy theory as neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a bundle of economic practices proposing the idea that the welfare of humankind can be best served by liberating individual business freedoms within an institutional structure, giving priority to strong property rights, free markets, and free internal and international trade. The role of the state, according to this theory, is to create and defend by all means this institutional structure, create the free markets if they do not exist, including in the sphere of electricity, telecommunications, water, education, healthcare, social security, and environmental protection, which have been previously exclusive state domains. Neoliberalism means practically the regulation of markets, privatization, and withdrawal of the state from many areas of social provision. It prevailed sooner or later in all states, including the states created after the collapse of Soviet Union and the other socialist countries or other capitalist welfare states. Some of them have chosen the neoliberal turn throughout democratic processes, others by coercive pressures from international organizations such as IMF, World Bank, or World Trade Organization. Other states, finally, were pushed to become neoliberal labs by dictatorships. The European Union by itself has undergone such a process by taking neoliberalism into its most significant legal document, the Treaty of the EU. What is the outcome of this restructuring process? Due to limited time availability, I will restrict my intervention on the impact on labor markets and working conditions, which is also the field I am best familiar with. Neoliberalism as regards labor market meant the regulation of labor, which has been offered and promoted, dressed in nice-sounding definitions like flexibility, elasticity, or mobility. These nice-sounding definitions, however, had devastating impact both on the terms and conditions of work. They actually promoted the absolute commodification of labor, which can be treated freely like any other commodity. The results of this policy is a continuous degradation of the workers' living standards. These neoliberal labor market reforms aimed in general at widening and deepening the informalization of labor in order to make labor as cheap as possible and boost the profit-making opportunities of businesses. They were imposed sometimes violently by suppressing trade union rights. Some other times they were brought by massive labor law reforms with the intention, as they say, to boost the economy's competitiveness or to make the economy investment-friendly. In other cases, yet again, they were introduced piece for piece or left to be regulated by the market forces rather by administrative measures. The latter, I believe, is the case of Cyprus. Traditionally, labor in Cyprus has been dominantly regulated by collective agreements, which 20 years ago boosted the coverage rate of around 80% of all workers and employees. We had, of course, in the last 20 years, various labor law reforms originating from the European Union integration process, which entailed various elements of neoliberal designing. However, in Cyprus, the most significant driver of informalization of labor was the remarkable degrees of coverage of workers by collective agreements to around 45%, and the increasing violation of collective agreements by employers. We attribute these developments, on the one hand, to the overproportional employment increase in traditionally informal sectors with low or even zero trade union present. This is the case, for example, in the retail and wholesale sector or some other service sector activities which gain employment importance in the last years, where trade union representation has always been weak. On the other hand, workers and employees are more often than in the past faced with intransigent and hostile employers where it comes to collective bargaining, who don't even hesitate to violate existing legislation protecting the rights of employees to organize and collectively struggle for their labor rights. The informal employment sector in Cyprus is also fed by the high increase of the so-called pursuit of services contracts, which is expanding both in the private and public activities. I must underline that, unfortunately, the public sector is the pioneer in this area. Young boys and girls and students, women and skilled workers and massively migrant workers are commonly pushing the informal corner of the Cyprus economy. Of course, all these policies, especially in the last 10 years, were supported and covered by the government's policies. Government with the policies of privatization, with the policies of dismantling the social welfare state, help all these processes. I will conclude my intervention by assuring you that we are not just miserable observers of these negative developments. We have, of course, our internal problems and shortcomings. However, we have not surrendered. We managed, in the very difficult years of the recent capitalist economic crisis of 2012-2015, where due to the unprecedented increase of unemployment, we lost a significant number of our members, not only to survive, but also to recover. We managed to protect the very institution of collective agreements, especially in the big sectors, and very significant employees' rights, such as the provident funds. Allow me at this point to refer to the most pressing issue workers, low and middle income families are faced with in the last 2 years. The issue of price increases, which are eroding day by day the workers' income and thus degrading their standard of living. Inflation began to rise over the normal level in the second half of 2021, initially as a result of production and trade disruptions caused by the COVID-19 crisis. The beginning of the war of Russia against Ukraine, the way the West and the European Union have chosen to sanction the aggression of Russia, and the lack of prospects to determine the war and the conflict by peaceful means, as well as the government's and central banks' policy mix to respond to the inflation, and are inflaming the cost of living crisis. It is in this context that our efforts and struggles for the redistribution of the cost of living allowance are becoming important. We have intensified our struggles, and we have already registered significant gains. This fight will continue so that the cost of living allowance is fully recovered and it covers all workers. It is also important to say that we do also struggle for minimum rights for all those workers that they are covered by the decree for minimum wage. Against all those who warn us of the so-called wage price spiral, we only have to reply that the only spiral operating right now is the profit price spiral. Dear friends, we know, of course, that the above described developments have shifted the balance of power towards the side of capital and businesses. We know also that the balance of power is best regulated through collective agreements. That's why our effort to increase the coverage rate of collective agreement is vital and lies in the center of our campaign. As the balance of power is critically disturbed, certain political interventions and legislative measures are required to be taken in order to facilitate the extension of coverage of collective agreement. That's why we call upon the government to take concrete measures so as to strengthen the impact of the collective agreements, and of course, to take concrete measures for the fairer redistribution of wealth. Finally, I want to use this opportunity to call upon all workers and employees to join us, to overcome their fears and any critical views they may have against organized struggles, to unite with other men and women in the common struggle for decent work with rights, decent working conditions, and fair pay, appropriate to secure an adequate standard of living for us, for our families, and the people we care about. This is the only way to protect people, the foreigners who are here, the local working class, all people. The current economic and social reality is not the end of history. It is a stage of an evolution. We need and we can overcome this stage with our coordinated struggles towards the real emancipation of humankind. Thank you for your attention.
We thank the General Secretary of PEO being here with us today and providing an insight of the character of the system and the outcome, the negative outcome on labor relations. The floor is now open to our audience. I believe we have approximately 20 minutes to discuss, and I would like to ask you to direct your questions or your comments to each one of our speakers by naming to whom you are referring to, and we'll start from this side, please, and then we'll take all the questions together. I think this is more effective. If any questions or comments, we are pleased to comment or reply. There is one, actually. No,
like
Costa, there is one comment, actually.
Oh, yeah? Sorry.
Yes.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the speeches. My question is mostly addressed to Ms. Charalambous. In Cyprus, I am under the impression that the coverage of collective agreements or membership in workers' unions is quite high in the government, in state institutions, in institutions of the private sector that are institutions of a more stable working environment, such as banks, for instance. My question is, what is the coverage in classes of workers who I understand are in a weaker position. We all every day are served by workers from third countries working in food delivery services. We see people working in the kitchens of restaurants who mostly come from third countries. What is the coverage there? How many of them are members of workers' unions and are covered by collective agreements? Thank you very much.
I underline in my speech, Cyprus traditionally was a country with a very high percentage of unionization. Actually, we used to be a role model from the ILO for this fact that we had a percentage of almost 85% of workers covered by collective agreements in the private and in the public sector. One of the processes that took place in the recent years due to the what I've described in my speech was the fact that today 1 out of 2 of employees are not covered by collective agreements. And of course, yes, mainly these people are in the private sector. We succeeded to continue to have strong collective agreement and a good coverage. I'm not saying a high coverage, a good coverage in sector like the construction area, the hotel area. In this process, third country citizens and citizens from other European countries were used not as cheap labor with the policy of personal contracts, using their need for a job. And this is a process that is undertaken now for more than 20 years, we must say. So we are now at this point, and you are very right, underlining that there are areas of the economy, especially restaurants, platform workers, that they are not unionized. Of course, I must say for the platform workers that we manage after the last strike they had, we unionized them, and now we are at the Ministry of Labor, at the mediation department, and we are discussing a collective agreement for the platform workers. Because the situation is like this, and because the employers are using many ways so to keep workers apart, away from trade union, that's why we say that there is a need for the government to take some measures in order to strengthen the collective bargaining process. Collective agreements in Cyprus, they are not legal documents. They are an agreement between the two sides. And of course, employers in this situation very easily say that no, even though my association, my organization agrees on a collective agreement, I am not obliged to implement this collective agreement. That's why we are demanding from the government to take legislative measures so that the core terms of a collective agreements to be obligatory for all the employers in that sector. And of course, to take the initiative for collective agreements in areas that they do not have collective agreements, and mainly third country citizens are employed in that sector. And for us, it's very clear that this is the only way to protect the third country citizens and the workers from other countries. This is the only way to increase the standard of living, and of course, this is the only way to fight racism.
Any other question or comment? after our discussion, either on the Cyprus issue or regards the characteristics of the... Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Very interesting discussion. Is it on? Oh, okay. So, okay, we're a small island. Our economy is limited because we are surrounded by sea. We can't just drive to another country, work, and then come back. So by that definition, we are limited. We managed to develop only some parts of our economy, our services, real estate, tourism, even though we managed to take our children through higher education at very high levels. So rather than trying to fix a bad situation by applying some ideologies that are not kind of prevalent in the world, shouldn't we play by the rules of the game, which is capitalism, develop our parts of economy, become competitive, bring more currency into the system, apply taxes, make the society fair? Because only when we increase the size of our economy and we bring more money in, then we can apply measures to make the society more equitable. Whereas if we turn our back to the rules of the game in the world and become more inward-looking, then we don't really allow our economy to develop as in step with the rest of the world. And now, for example, in Limassol, where I live, we have all these companies coming in. They're looking for people who are experts in IT, and they can't find any local talent, and they have to bring people from outside, give them massive salaries. Obviously, they're pricing people out from rents and everything. So really part of the root cause is us not being responsible enough and not to have the foresight at the time to develop our economy and to develop our skills as a society to be able to compete with the world. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. I think it's mostly directed either to Professor Kostas Gouliamos, and maybe Sotiroula Charalambous has something to add at the end. But Professor will start.
Yeah, I fully understand the point. That was not exactly a question, but a point, I would say. I fully understand your point. But in any case, because you use the term to play the game, how do you say that? Okay, the rules of the game. But who makes the rules of the game? That's a big question, okay? Or not a big question, it is a very critical question. Who makes the rules of the game? So, and in our time, we observe the globalization of war and the globalization of crisis. Who is responsible for it? I think, to my opinion, methodologically speaking, as you know, the way that the global structure of imperialism and capitalism exercise the imperialist culture. So, and not only that, I would like to add to the fact that within this sense, within this framework, the rules of the game is made by the so-called, by Eisenhower, long time ago, you know, the industrial, military, and I will add technological complex. So we go back to the basics, in other words, to the capitalist, and the capitalist buildings that exist or are exercise their politics around the world.
A big and important player to have a say in the rules of the game. We're a small country.
So this is something that is strictly related to politics. In other words, we have to fight. We have to strangle in order to reverse the existing model, the existing capitalist model. We cannot work. It's not a working model. We say that.
Discussion, if I may, even though it's not directly related to the Cyprus problem on which I was asked to offer my views today. Allow me just to say that ideologies, to start with, should not be seen as an inward way of analyzing and understanding the world. They are a tool to actually understand how the rules are being made and towards which direction. And to this, I would like to add one example, which I think is quite relevant to your question and to your point. Now, there is a discussion in the European Union as to whether we should completely abandon the special majority procedures for taking decisions at the level of the Council and shift towards whether we should actually adopt the special majority procedures and fully abandon the unanimity rule. So that's a rule under discussion. But what we have to understand, and it's on the shoulders of the politicians and the governments to decide which direction they'll choose, if, let's say, the unanimity rule is abandoned, then who is going to be making the decisions and what the content of those decisions will be and how this will affect smaller states such as Cyprus. So when we're taking even, let's say, more ideological as they're characterized decisions or positions and perspective, we must always bear in mind that this affects the rules of the game and the way that decisions are being made and how these, in the long term, affect the content of the policies in every single aspect of our life, political, social, and economical. Thank you.
Of course, we know that Cyprus is a small country and we need foreign investment and so on. And we know that this is the system in which we have to operate and work in. But I think we have to ask something ourselves. First, even in the capitalist system, this was not have been always the rule of the game. In this capitalist system, there was times of the history, especially after Second World War, that workers with their struggles and governments created the so-called welfare state. Is it the rule of the game that governments have nothing to do in setting some rules that everyone has to fulfill in social and labor rights? Is it the rule of the game, big firms to close the doors and say, no, I don't recognize the constitutional right of the Cypriot people, of the Cypriot workers, of all workers to be unionized and organized? And we had a very recent case on that. So we know the play. We know very well the play. The question we have to ask ourselves is, do we want this society of expanding inequalities? If this is the society we want to live, okay.
We ran out of time, actually. We can have our discussions after we finish from here. I'm very sorry. Thank you very much all for being here today. Thank you, Cyprus Forum, for inviting Prometheus Research Institute for being part of your discussions. We hope you have a very interactive and fruitful discussion today, and we might proceed or we might evaluate and assess more outside with a coffee and a drink. Thank you.